Ezekiel 4:1 through 5:4. Devotional focus verse. Thou also, son of man, take thee a tile, and lay it before thee, and pourtray upon it the city, even Jerusalem, and lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it. Set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Ezekiel 4:1 and 2. Symbolic action is not a novel concept to us. It is both familiar and pervasive in our culture. We understand that when the referee at a football game throws down a yellow flag, he is indicating an infraction of the rules has occurred. When a military veteran places his hand over his heart while reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, we know he is proclaiming his commitment to flag and country. On a more juvenile level, when a 7-year-old girl scowls ferociously and sticks out her tongue at a bully on the playground, we have no problem grasping that she is expressing disgust. In each of these examples, the individual is communicating through symbolic actions rather than words. In today's text, the prophet Ezekiel's actions were also symbolic in nature. These unique activities were not undertaken casually or impulsively. They were difficult steps of obedience to God, who commanded them as a message to his people. First, Ezekiel was told to depict Jerusalem on a tile, showing it as though it were under siege by an enemy. He was to lie next to his object lesson in the sight of the people for a portion of 430 days to represent the number of years of God's punishment on Israel and then Judah. Next, God instructed Ezekiel to make bread from specific ingredients. Since bread was usually made from wheat alone, the use of coarser materials implied that grain of every kind would be extremely scarce during the coming siege, and people would use whatever materials were available to make their bread. The meager amount of daily food and water Ezekiel was to consume in sight of the people illustrated that the resulting famine would allow very limited portions of food and drink for each individual. In verses 1 through 4 of chapter 5, the prophet was commanded to shave his head and beard and then dispose of the hair in a variety of specific ways. This was to illustrate how the people caught in the attack on Jerusalem would perish or be dispersed. The purpose of all these symbolic acts was to impress upon the people that, as a consequence of their continued disobedience, God's judgment was certain and would be severe. God was showing them that their sins would bring them to the most extreme deprivation and shame. Ezekiel's symbolic actions were pictures without words for the instruction of the faithless and unbelieving people around him. In our world today, those around us are also predominantly unbelievers. What kind of pictures without words would God have us present to them? What are some ways we can demonstrate our commitment to God? While our actions likely will not be as dramatic or unique as those of Ezekiel, they can still have an impact on the unbelievers around us. Background information. Today's text describes God's instructions to Ezekiel regarding a 4-part action sermon he was to dramatize before the people. In verses 1 through 3, Ezekiel was told to act out the siege itself. He was to take a clay tablet and draw on it a likeness of Jerusalem. Around this, he was to build recognizable military apparatuses. The iron pan, in verse 3, was a flat griddle that stood upright, creating a barrier between Ezekiel and the model, denoting the people's separation from God. The phrase, "Set thy face against it," signified God's wrath that was directed toward Jerusalem for the people's disobedience, as had been forewarned in Leviticus 26:14 through 39. With this model in front of him, Ezekiel was to lay on his side for a portion of 430 consecutive days as an illustration of God's judgment. The time spent on his left side pertained to the northern kingdom of Israel. Though previously taken into captivity by the Assyrians, Israel was included in this portrayal of judgment because God saw Israel and Judah as one nation. Israel's 390 days represented the years of their iniquity from Jeroboam's establishing of idolatry in 975 BC to the soon-coming fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. See verse 5. The 40 days Ezekiel was to spend on his right side represented the years of God's warning to Judah, beginning with Jeremiah's ministry. Ezekiel's bare arm outstretched towards the model typified warriors' arms being unencumbered by robes for ease of movement during battle. See verse 7. Verses 9 through 17 describe Ezekiel's portrayal of the famine that would overtake the city. He was instructed to eat only small amounts of coarse bread, baked in a very crude and disagreeable way. The strange mixture of fine and coarse grains and legumes stored in one vessel portrayed both scarcity and the indiscriminate nature of the coming disaster all classes of people would suffer. During each of the first 390 days, the prophet was to measure out a portion of meal, about 11 ounces, form it into a disc, and cook it over a small fire for rationed eating throughout the day. He was also to limit himself to approximately 20 ounces of drinking water per day. Originally, his fire was to be fueled by human dung, but when Ezekiel was grieved by the ritual uncleanliness of this, God allowed him to use cow dung. His measuring, preparing, and eating was to be done in front of the people so that they would see the prophecy. The staff in verse 16 refers to the supply of bread, which God would break or cut off. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, Ezekiel's hair represented the people of Judah, the knife represented Nebuchadnezzar, and the balances, God's precise and exacting judgments. These verses relate that immediately following the 430 days spent on his sides, Ezekiel was to shave off and weigh his hair and beard and divide it into 3 portions. The first portion was to be burned on the clay tablet that served as a model of Jerusalem, representing those who would die during the siege. The second portion was to be chopped up around the model using the knife. This depicted the people who would be killed by the sword in and around the city during the attack. The third portion pointed to those who would be taken to foreign lands as captives. The few hairs tucked into Ezekiel's garment symbolized the few Jews who would be left behind by Nebuchadnezzar. The hairs drawn from them and thrown into the fire indicated those who would again disobey God and flee to Egypt for security. Conclusion. Our actions as Christians may not get as much attention as those of Ezekiel, but they can still have an impact on the unbelievers around us.
Ezekiel chapter 4. Thou also, son of man, take thee a tile, and lay it before thee, and pourtray upon it the city, even Jerusalem. And lay siege against it, and build a fort against it, and cast a mount against it, set the camp also against it, and set battering rams against it round about. Moreover take thou unto thee an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between thee and the city, and set thy face against it, and it shall be besieged, and thou shalt lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days, I have appointed thee each day for a year. Therefore thou shalt set thy face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and thine arm shall be uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it. And, behold, I will lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to another, till thou hast ended the days of thy siege. Take thou also unto thee wheat, and barley, and beans, and lentiles, and millet, and fitches, and put them in one vessel, and make thee bread thereof, according to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon thy side, 390 days shalt thou eat thereof. And thy meat which thou shalt eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day, from time to time shalt thou eat it. Thou shalt drink also water by measure, the 6th part of an hin, from time to time shalt thou drink. And thou shalt eat it as barley cakes, and thou shalt bake it with dung that cometh out of man, in their sight. And the Lord said, Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I will drive them. Then said I, Ah Lord God! Behold, my soul hath not been polluted, for from my youth up even till now have I not eaten of that which dieth of itself, or is torn in pieces, neither came their abominable flesh into my mouth. Then he said unto me, Lo, I have given thee cow's dung for man's dung, and thou shalt prepare thy bread therewith. Moreover he said unto me, Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight, and with care, and they shall drink water by measure, and with astonishment. That they may want bread and water, and be astonied one with another, and consume away for their iniquity. Ezekiel chapter 5. And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp knife, take thee a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon thine head and upon thy beard, then take thee balances to weigh, and divide the hair. Thou shalt burn with fire a 3rd part in the midst of the city, when the days of the siege are fulfilled, and thou shalt take a 3rd part, and smite about it with a knife, and a 3rd part thou shalt scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. Thou shalt also take thereof a few in number, and bind them in thy skirts. Then take of them again, and cast them into the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire, for thereof shall a fire come forth into all the house of Israel.